Without further ado, I would like to welcome Kat Gaines, Senior Manager and Developer Advocacy and Community Manager at PagerDuty. She enjoys talking and thinking about incident response, customer support, and automation, and all of that for the creation of end-user and customer experience. And she'll be talking about mastering incident communications.
Thank you. All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. Nice to meet you. As it was said, my name is Kat Gaines. I work at PagerDuty, and I run developer advocacy and community there. And so I have a lot of feelings about incident response, a lot about communication. Some of my background is in technical support, so we'll be discussing a little bit as well how those folks can play an impact in these processes. Just again, quick recap, info about me. My LinkedIn QR code is up on the screen if you'd like to get in touch with me. My Twitter handle is there too. I don't really use Twitter, so LinkedIn is probably a better way if you do want to get in touch. Just to start us off, I'm going to tell a little bit of a story. In October 2021, I remember my mom texting me about an issue she was having on Facebook. She uses Facebook probably more than anyone I know, and she couldn't access her Facebook page. It's pretty typical. Something goes wrong on the internet, and she texts me because I work in tech, so I must know how to fix everything on the internet, right? I don't work for Facebook. I never have. And even if I did, it was kind of a big deal. It wouldn't have been a one-person problem to fix. This is the explanation they posted later on their engineering blog or their status page or something. It's a pretty long issue. A lot of us would look at this and, kind of get the gist of what is going on at least and think, okay, I understand it. My mom, though, who is in her 70s, I've worked for PagerDuty for almost 10 years, and she still doesn't really know what I do, doesn't understand this message. So at this point, she doesn't know, obviously, that there are things like status pages, engineering blogs, things that she can read to get this kind of information. But even if she did, she'd be a little lost reading this message as, relatively typical Facebook user. So the point here really isn't to shame anyone, not my mom, not the choices made by Meta in this moment to post this language. Obviously, for those of us who get it, they wanted to post a technical explanation. But the point here is to highlight some opportunity. You really do have to speak the same language as your customers, especially when you're writing things like status page updates and so on. I don't have insight into what happened here and how this communication went out, but I do have a suspicion that if maybe they had someone advocating for customers when they have major issues and able to look at language like this and say, great, that's helpful, but we also need a little bit more of a user-friendly explanation as well, that someone like my mom could have understood what's going on. They're the target audience and the language they need to speak in this moment. Again, the point isn't shame. We've all made those types of mistakes where we just post our understanding without really going into a deep explanation. We're all going to keep doing it. We're going to make mistakes a lot. But we can learn a little bit about the importance of involving customer-facing teams in critical moments to make sure that we're just translating correctly. There's a really big gap that you have to mind between how your customers perceive your product and how your team perceives your product. When you're looking at the back end most of the time, you're often not interacting with the face of it necessarily, or maybe your uses are a little bit different than an old German lady in her 70s, for example. We're going to set aside best practices that we all preach about for now that should enable all of your teams to understand your customers. Even if you're following those practices to the letter and you think, yes, I have it handled, I'm perfect. Newsflash, you're not, and that gap still exists. A lot of it is about language. A lot of us refer to the exact same things, components, pieces of what we're working on in completely different ways, not just from us to our customers, but across our organizations as well. So, let's not even talk about what happens when we throw marketing, for example, in there, right? Terms get pretty twisted. Everyone has different versions of what's going on. So this is a pretty big chart. We're not going to go completely deep into it. This is PagerDuty's basic chart of roles in incident response. We're really focusing on the orange here, the liaison roles, the people who are meant to communicate with others and help them understand what is happening when something is not going to plan. It's just good to remember where they sit in the process, though. That's why I'm showing this slide. And as far as who can fill this role, you have a pretty cool superpower team in your organization, customer support, who has a pretty great advantage here. They work with your customers all day, every single day. That's literally their job. They're there to support your customers. So they speak their language really natively. They understand exactly how they see the product and how they talk about it. They also, hopefully, interact with you and speak your language as well, so they understand the technical components of the product, how the company sees it as well. And so they're kind of best positioned to bring those two perspectives together and discuss what's happening in the product at those moments. They've seen it all too. They've made mistakes, they've course corrected, they found the right ways to communicate with customers, they found out what definitely does not work and what not to repeat. So all of these problems are unique, but especially those more seasoned support team members are going to have found that common language to speak to folks and just get the message across. So before we dive deeper, we're just going to overview a little bit how liaisons actually function during an incident or a service degradation, whatever you may call it. Outage is not a term I usually jump to because it's a little dramatic, but you might call it that at your organization. So if that's what you recognize, that's great. So these folks can be, again, a link to your customers and your stakeholders through the incident. It's really important for the rest of the incident command staff to be able to just focus on what they're doing and what's going on rather than the communication piece and trying to figure out exactly the right words. And the role can be all in one, or it can be split into the two separate roles you saw on that last slide. So it can be external, internal, or both. Whoever it is, their job is to notify customers of what's happening now, to craft some appropriate status updates, and make sure that the right notification messages are going out. And they also have to bring data back in to the incident call itself so that the incident commander, for example, knows what is happening on the customer side. What are they talking about? What's going on? There we go. They can also play a few really interesting roles in incidents as well. They can, of course, communicate with customers. That's what we've been talking about. They can also aggregate data around customer-reported issues. So maybe there are symptoms your customers are seeing that your engineering team isn't aware of, for example, that might help you actually diagnose what's going on if you're still kind of hunting down root cause. They can help prioritize SLAs. There might be, for example, service level agreements that certain customers have because they've maybe paid up to a certain tier of at least response when something is happening, or they may have an SLA around availability of the product that they are hammering your customer support team to make sure that you meet. We're talking already a little bit about liaisons and stakeholder communications. We'll talk a little bit about the internal side as well. And then they can also help with, whether you call it an incident review, a post-mortem, a root cause analysis. They can be part of that information as well and bring that information in. So, how do we get here? First, we want to start with just laying a foundation. So we talked a little bit about the two different types of folks that you'll have as customer liaisons. Stakeholder communications are going to be your internal folks, the folks that, just one moment here, sorry, the folks internally that need to know what's going on. That could be anyone from the rest of your support team to other customer-facing teams to, maybe your CEO who wants to jump in on the call and ask what's going on and interrupt the response efforts. So that customer liaison should be involved in incident response, but that team as a whole also needs to be treated as stakeholders, just so they're equipped during an incident. Having those stakeholder communications will provide some situational awareness, some transparency around the actual impact in real time around what's going on. And you also want those updates to be pretty proactive, so no one's caught off guard. That internal liaison has to think ahead as much as they possibly can, so that when you have that well-defined communications process during your incident, it just benefits your whole organization. A couple of the bullet points we have here, it gives everyone a more consistent understanding of the current incident across the organization, so you don't have sales saying one thing, technical support saying something else, prod dev saying something different, the CEO is saying something to the press if it's really big. You have one consistent message throughout the organization. That's crucial. Also, some broader real-time awareness of what's going on. Again, avoiding those interruptions of folks jumping into the call, asking for a status update when you are just trying to fix the issue, and that more consistent narrative to share externally, which I touched on a moment ago. So how do you get that? Is by just having consistent ideas of the information that you want to include. We've got some examples here. Things like when the incident began, when did it start? Just a brief description, too, of any services that are impacted by the incident. What parts of your business are going to be affected? What impact is it having on customers? If you know it, if you don't, say you don't know. That's okay to admit and say that you're hunting down the cause, or that you're even enlisting the help of customer-facing teams to understand the symptoms themselves. Where to find more information? This is a pretty crucial one because, again, people will jump into incident calls and interrupt if they don't know where to go. So something we do at PagerDuty, our best practice, is that we have a Slack channel that the rest of the company knows to go to and see updates around what's happening. We also, of course, use our own product because our product is in this space. And so we send out internal stakeholder notifications through PagerDuty to parties who will want to know what's going on, whether it's the executive team, PR, and so on, so that they know they can rely on those sources for information. They don't have to run around hunting for it. Similarly, the location of a service status page. You may have an external status page for customers to check when you have an incident, but you might also consider, if you don't already, having an internal one as well to be just another one of those sources of truth for people to look at and say, great, I know exactly where to go, where the information is, and that tells me what's happening. You also want some guidance on how to respond when customers are asking you for more details. I'm talking about support teams a lot, but this really applies to anyone who may ever talk to a customer. Hopefully that should be your whole company, but anyone who may ever consider talking to a customer, especially in the moment of an incident, should have some guidelines on how to respond to them and discuss that. And then finally, how often to expect updates. Expectation setting is really crucial. That is, again, one of the ways that you avoid interruption in a critical moment. And so just saying, we're going to update in about 20 minutes. Even if you don't have something in 20 minutes, just sending an update saying, hey, guess what? We don't have anything new yet, will still help avoid interruptions, help keep that consistency of expectation and narrative across the organization itself. You're also going to want to look at how you talk about terminology. So I mentioned earlier that even across organizations, we have multiple ways we may talk about multiple different things. So one thing you want to think of is if you are partnering with customer-facing teams who are potentially running or at least having heavy involvement in these communications, ensuring that they understand the terms that fall into the categories on this slide. This is not all of it, though, but at least these terms. So if you already have close relationships with them, great. Make sure that you have these defined and written down somewhere. If not, it's time to start working on it. Let them ask some questions. Make sure you give them support, building relationships. A lot of us who have had a technical support background have had at least one job where we're not allowed to talk to engineering or we're made to feel as though we're interrupting them if we ask for information. Don't be those people. Give them the ability to talk to you, build those healthy relationships, and give them the opportunity to ask questions about tool stacks, infrastructure, terminology that they may not come across in their day-to-day. And ask them, too, what they don't think they know, or at least ask their leadership to ask them that so that you're getting a comprehensive view of how you can help them in those moments. If they understand your world, they're going to better understand what's happening when it's not functioning as expected. So some things they might ask about are tools that others in your teams might know, but anyone else from across the org might get lost in. Especially if you have maybe really nice bespoke names of internal tools and you came up with a naming system that you're really proud of and it's maybe cute and has a couple of puns. People don't understand what that means. So make sure to define it for them somewhere. Give them a wiki page or some other kind of internal documentation, or at least just sit with them and talk it out so they can write it down for themselves. That brings us to internal code names. So tooling isn't the only thing that gets assigned that often. Things like product launches are really popular to assign code names to, or creative names for teams or working groups. It's fine. It's part of how we make work a little bit light and fun if maybe we name all of our conference rooms after Simpsons episodes or things like that. A lot of us have been there, but you still have to explain what it means to someone else if they may not intuitively understand it right away. And then my personal favorite / pet peeve is freaking acronyms. So it's more secret code that people may or may not understand. They're things that often they become second nature to your company. Maybe you have a whole bunch of acronyms that everyone in the company knows, and that's fine. But guess what happens when someone new joins the company? They have an acronym library to get up to speed on. I actually saw someone at our company make a very valiant effort once at making an acronym glossary, and she had this beautiful wiki page written out, and it worked for 2 weeks before there were like 20 more acronyms to add to the list. And that's just kind of the velocity of how these things happen. So even if you think it's a commonplace acronym, even if you're like, everyone knows that, if you know, you know. But don't make it so you have to know. Just spell it out for them. These are the things that people may not understand, whether it's they just haven't been at your company before, they come from a different cultural or language background. Any of those things may confuse them. So please define it. So once you've laid that foundation, you want to make sure your team has the tools to work on it. They need to get the job done when things happen. So in that toolkit, there are a few things. They need to know where to get information. Anyone doing this communication needs to know, for example, what collaboration tools are out there. You need to know that you have a channel of information established and clear. We talked already about what we do at PagerDuty, things like getting information through a Slack channel, knowing that where folks can go, classics like Jira tickets. If they have other tools that just give them information, they need to just know where the tools are, and they need to know it early for this to work. There's a question mark here too, because some of those might look different. It just depends on what works for your team, but you need to know where it is, and you need to document what those places are. The next one is process. This person who's running communications has to know their role in incident response. For a lot of our companies, this can fall into, again, a customer liaison or communications role, but you do need those clearly defined roles on how your team interacts with this and a description for them. And if you need some inspiration, see me later. We have all kinds of literature at PagerDuty on this topic. We have operations guides that walk you through our recommendations step by step. But if you do decide to communicate on an incident, which you will at some point, it's important that you have an agreed upon set of criteria for when a major incident is communicated. Things like false alarms and short-lived issues can sometimes really kick things off, so knowing when communication is appropriate and what the whole process is just helps your customers avoid widespread panic. So you'll want to consider things like the following. What products are affected? What do we know? How noticeable is the impact? Is the impact, for example, something a customer may want to have contingencies for? You really just want to be ready in the call to pay attention to how things are progressing, have that communications role update their peers, and then have a plan for those customer-facing updates. Speaking of which, I cannot strongly enough recommend having some templates for customer-facing updates. It can sound almost a little bit in opposition to what we want to do. We want to have personalized communication that's clear and specific, right? But if you have templates that at least give you the bones of a message, that give you an outline of what to say and how to say it, you're not going to churn cycles just trying to figure out how to make words in a moment when something is happening. Instead, you can kind of just Mad Lib style fill in the blanks and say, okay, this service is affected. Here's what we know. Here's what we expect. Here's when we will update you next. Give folks those templates so that they don't have to start from scratch, especially with those really early on messages in communication where you really might not know much about the nature of the incident itself. You do want to think about those. Next, they'll want to think about breaking it down for their customers. So the last thing you ever want this communications liaison role to do is to ask an incident commander or a subject matter expert to say, hey, can you draft communication for this? They're a little busy in that moment, either running the incident or tracking down the issue and trying to fix it. they're functioning as, again, subject matter experts. And so that person who's running communications should be listening in on the call. They should be listening to the details of what's happening. They should be catching up with what the scribe has captured if they're not able to keep up. But again, they are the experts on communication, and so they do need to step into their authority in that space and start fresh. They should be drafting their understanding of what's going on, asking the incident commander for a review. If you are the incident commander, help them and give them the time for a review and/or give them time to make adjustments that you see fit. They will, though, have to consider things like customer perspective. So if there's something in there that doesn't make sense to you right away, double check with them if maybe that's why, because they need to know that the customer gets it from this perspective. And try to equip them too. We talked about good relationships and tooling. Things like system maps can be really helpful. You might have one of those internally if you know that maybe your team who's running communications, if it's a support team, might look at it and go, I don't know what this means. Maybe consider drafting an extra version that just kind of clarifies for them which internal pieces map to the external pieces customers see. So again, when we go back to that terminology we were talking about earlier, they fully understand what everything means. And then finally, choosing phrasing is really, really important. Whether it's in a template or whether it's something from scratch, things they're going to have to keep in mind and that you can help them with are, first, keeping it basic, just making sure that it explains what's going on, no more, no less. It doesn't go in too deep. Centering the customer experience, again, that's who's going to be reading this, and so centering the symptoms they're going to see, defining terms for them if there are ones the customer may not know, but folks at the company may. Prioritizing quality over quantity. A clear, short communication is miles better than one that is several paragraphs long. Setting their expectations, I mentioned that earlier with internal communication, but just making sure that it's clear for them when they can expect updates next, even if, again, you don't think you'll have a meaningful update at the next update cadence. Just tell them that, hey, we're still working on it, the status is the same, we will let you know when we know. But do update them regularly. You do want to set a cadence with them and an expectation that they know that you're on it. They know that you're working on it. They know that something is happening. And they know they're not going to have to reach out over and over asking, what's the status now? What's the status now? They can check a status page. They can check something else that will give them that clear piece of information. And then finally, communicating. So in the first communication, just some quick, something is happening. We're going to send it out in 5 minutes. We're going to use those templates. I'm going to speed through a couple of these because I only have a couple of minutes left. In that second communication, again, a little bit more information. I'm saying 5 minutes. It sounds fast, but you know at least something with these cadences. You know at least a little bit, and getting it out a little bit earlier is better than waiting around and saying, what do we do? What do we know? And with those updates, you want things like changes to impact and scope. I said 20 minutes a couple times earlier in the presentation. That's mostly because that is what we often recommend for folks as a starter cadence. But again, do what works for you. Tell them about anything you're doing to recover or mitigate. Keep setting those expectations. And then if it gets long, if you realize it's going to hang out for maybe a few hours or so, don't call that too early because you don't want to cause alarm if it's not due. But if you do realize that something is going to become a long-running incident, it's going to take a few hours to mitigate or some unknown amount of time, go ahead and tell your customers that. You might update them less regularly. Every 20 minutes might become pretty unfeasible, but you do want to still let them know how often you're going to update them. And then, of course, when you're recovered, let them know. Be clear that there's lasting impact, close out any recovery items that need to happen, and most importantly, make sure that everyone on the team gets some rest, especially if it's one of those long-running incidents. Let everyone take time to take a breather. I talk about this a lot because we just leave it out a lot in communication about these types of things, and it is important to take that step back before you go into incident review mode, before you continue to either set expectations internally or externally with customers, and just let everyone say, okay, woof, we did it. Now we get to take a beat, and then we get to go back and figure out what's next. Speaking of what's next, so this is really a primer. Like I said, we have a lot of documentation on this, just miles of documentation, honestly. You do want to keep iterating on some tools and process once you have a really good communication process set up. So do things like hygiene check-ins, talk about how the communication side of the process is working. You are probably or hopefully already doing a lot of this for your incident review process overall, but you want to make sure that the communication piece is really included in that as well. If your customer support team are the ones running the customer liaison role, get them involved in those hygiene check-ins, talking about the stakeholders, what did and didn't work with communications, especially during a post-incident review as soon as something has happened. And then consider even formalizing the role if you haven't. So it's something that I have seen for multiple support teams. It's become a career platform, basically, where they either have a dedicated role or it's something where upon they move into an incident review team later on, that can be really useful and helpful to have those folks dedicated to it in the organization. Again, this was the quick and fast primer. My LinkedIn code is, again, up there if you want to send me messages, talk later after the conference if you can't find me in person later. I also included one of our operations guide. It's at response.pagerduty.com. That is our overall incident response guide, so it is very meaty and very large, but there are several others that if you scroll down to the bottom of that page, they'll dive into different facets of the process as well. Some of this communications piece, even for support folks, we have one dedicated to them. So there's a lot of information there that will just help you kind of use what you heard here today to jumpstart. And with that, I will say thank you so much.
Is there any questions?
Yeah, if we have time, that's fine.
Yeah, we can take one or two, for sure.
I see one back there.
Thank you for the talk. You mentioned a lot of communication with customers during the incident. A few of the big incidents, I can think of GitLab when they dropped that production database way back in 2017, and lots since. They've published the postmortem report publicly. Do you have opinions to share on sharing that this postmortem with the public? Because I mean, I wasn't even a GitLab customer, but I learned a lot from reading from their own mishap.
Yeah. Yeah, those can be just incredibly useful to learn from. So yeah, I think like our recommendation is usually share as much as you can with customers, share it publicly. We don't gate our status page. It's open for anyone to see. And I think a lot of the companies that do this the best I see don't gate their status page. So, and those postmortems just go right up on that page. And so I know that some folks do say, oh, you have to be a customer, you have to have a login, or we'll share it with you privately. That's not usually the recommendation because, as you mentioned, there can be a lot of learnings from those things.
All right. Thank you very much, Kat.
Thank you.